What's up guys, welcome back to Deck Tech for Decks. I'm your host Caleb. If you guys want to support the channel, you can click on that whatnot link in the description down below. You'll get a free $15 whenever you sign up, and again, you'll be supporting the channel. Also, special shout out to my high contributing patrons, Newsome and Irrelevant. You guys rock. Now let's get into today's Deck Tech with Baylen, and this bunny is kind of pushed. Now I will say that this thing has a very high ceiling. We're not going to be doing this strategy, but any of the rosy cotton lines that generate infinite creatures does just allow you to cast your entire deck, right? Because Baylen, all she has to do is tap them down to draw a ton of cards, then tap more down to generate mana, and then she could also have infinite power on top of that. Then you just cast a Chandra's Ignition and win the game. So I think the ceiling for this commander is super high. We're gonna do a little bit of a more fun strategy and a little bit less spiky at the same time, but it's still going to be very powerful because this commander has some busted abilities. Let's get into what these busted abilities are. We can tap 2 untapped tokens to generate 1 mana, tap 3 untapped tokens to draw a card, or tap 4 untapped tokens to put 3 counters on Baylen. Now, notably, these are just tokens. These don't have to be creature tokens, so we can abuse stuff like Smothering Tithe, generate a ton of treasure tokens, and we can tap our treasure tokens to generate a ton of value. Now, the strategy I kind of want to go here is use stuff like Illustrious Wanderglyph, and then maybe some Seedborn Muse effects. That way we're able to untap all of our tokens on each of our opponent's untap step and generate a ton of value. We're also not going to ignore that third ability to tap 4 tokens, since it's going to be feasible to do that in this deck, again with our Seedborn Muse and Drum Bellower effects. And then we're going to get benefit off of her ability because she's going to be massive. We can use stuff like the Reaver Cleaver to deal combat damage and generate a ton of treasure tokens. We are also going to be playing All Will Be One, which it's kind of going to be a lightning bolt with our commander's ability. All we have to do is tap 4 tokens and then we get to lightning bolt anything. That can be incredibly powerful. Not to mention, the other thing we're going to be focusing on in this strategy is the combat step. We're playing cards like Anim Pakal that generates increasingly more tokens whenever she attacks, judging on her power, and we've got a lot of ways to buff up power in this deck. I know people don't like to keep track of this card, but using stuff like Cathar's Crusade, don't know why that's hard to say, is going to be incredibly busted in this deck. 3 tokens enter the battlefield, put 3 counters on the entire board, and it's just going to be very hard for our opponents to deal with that. We are also going to be playing some other stuff like these Ancient Dragons. Now, the fact that we can just roll a d20 and out of nowhere have 20 treasure tokens or 20 of those dragon tokens is going to be very impactful with this commander, because we can get instant value off of them by tapping them down and either drawing cards, generating mana, or making Baylen massive. Last but not least, we are going to be having or playing Halo Fountain in this deck. It's kind of the perfect card in this deck because you actually untap those creatures to activate Halo Fountain's ability, so you're able to untap stuff to then tap more stuff down to generate more value off of Baylen. This is going to kind of be a crazy token deck, and we all know Naya's already, very capable of making some very crazy token commanders or crazy token strategies happen, and this is probably one of the best Naya token commanders we've gotten in a long time. So if that sounds like a deck tech you want to get into, let's get into it. We're going to open this video up by talking about the various ways we can generate tokens in the early game and then in the late game. Then we're going to go over the win cons, and last but not least, we're going to talk about the super synergistic cards that are just going to provide a ton of value with this commander. Kicking it off with our token generation, we're going to start with the early game. We have Spring Heart Nantuko. Now this basically just generates us an insect whenever a land enters the battlefield, but if we bestow it, we get a token copy of that creature that it's bestowed upon instead. So this has some very good utility, and it's very flexible. Horn of Gondor just sits on the battlefield, it makes us a human, and then it's just going to double the amount of humans we have every single turn. It does cost a little bit of mana to get that going because it's 3 to activate it, but remember, our commander does eventually allow us to tap some of our tokens for mana, so it can start paying for itself. Professional Facebreaker is going to be amazing here. I really wanted to focus on cards that can generate up to 3 tokens a turn because that's where we're going to get our card advantage, and it does give us ramp as as well. Not to mention we do have extra combat steps in this deck, so that means this girl's ceiling is super high. Adeline and Andoril, again, sticking with that theme to generate tokens whenever we attack. Not to mention, again, Adeline's going to be generating 3 treasure tokens every single combat. Krinko 10th Street Kingpin, Anim Packout, Myrail Shield of Argive, all of these trigger whenever they attack, and they're all exponential. That means whenever these get bigger, we're going to generate more tokens, and in Myrail's case, whenever we have more soldiers on the battlefield, we generate more tokens. So with extra combat steps, these cards get absolutely crazy super fast. Not to mention, we do have other ways to buff Anim Packout and Krinko in the deck, so with something like a Cathar's Crusade, these 2 cards get insane. Reese the Redeemed has an insanely high ceiling in the deck. If we have a decent board of tokens and a Seedborn Muse or Drum Bellower on the battlefield, this girl's going to untap on each of our opponent's untap step. So this means we can 4x our board every single rotation, and that's just going to drown our opponents in tokens. Call the Coppercoats is a perfect card in this deck because it has a very low floor and a very high ceiling. So it scales into the late game, and early game we can cast it and probably generate up to 3 tokens. Fable of the Mirror Breaker is also going to get an include here. Remember, I'm locked in to try to generate 3 tokens with 1 card, and this card does that. We get that Goblin that generates treasure tokens, and then we can flip it and start making even more tokens. The Reaver Cleaver and Scepter of Celebration. These are no-brainers in the deck. Because our commander can get absolutely massive, we're going to connect, generate treasure tokens or creature tokens, then we're going to tap those creature tokens down to make our commander bigger, and then next turn we're just going to make even more tokens. This deck is just going to have the potential to snowball out of control very quickly, especially when we're including cards like Krinko. This guy on his own is kind of insane, and then you start adding cards like Drum Bellower or Seedborn Muse, and he gets really insane. This guy generates an instant board state very quickly, and our commander is just going to be able to utilize all of those goblins we're creating on each of our opponent's turn to generate value, whether that be mana or card advantage, whatever you want, or we can even make her bigger. Felidar Retreat seems solid here. I know it's not as exponential as some of the other cards in this deck, but it's very useful because of the vigilance it gives to all of our tokens. So we can slam a land, buff our entire board state, all of them get vigilance, and that's just going to allow us to tap all of our tokens down with our commander instead of having to tap them down whenever we attack. Not to mention, in the early game, it does generate us a board state. Smothering Tithe, absolutely insane. We're going to get a ton of treasure tokens, and then we're going to be able to tap those treasure tokens down for value. Wildfire Awakener. This is a crazy creature because it has Convoke and then X. So we're able to tap down all of our creatures to help fuel this X ability that's going to give us these 1/1 red elementals that deal 1 damage to target player whenever they're tapped, which is what this deck is trying to do. Moving on, we have the at each upkeep triggers with Dragon Broodmother, Illustrious Wanderglyph, and Tendershoot Dryad. I like these in the deck because we are running Cutsil, and these do buff all of their creatures they create. Tendershoot gives +2/+2, Illustrious gives +2/+2, and the Dragon Broodmother has those Devour Dragons that can just eat a creature, and then it enters the battlefield with counters on it, ready to trigger our Cutsil. Each one of these has the ability to generate 4 treasure tokens of rotation since they trigger on each upkeep, so that's 4 tokens that our commander can use to trigger, and that turns all of our commander's abilities on, making these perfect includes to the deck. Then we have our insane token generators with Ancient Copper Dragon, Ancient Gold Dragon, and Old Gnawbone. The fact that we're able to roll a d20 and then possibly end up with 20 tokens to then trigger our commander a ton can really swing the game in our favor. Not to mention, Old Gnawbone, this guy doesn't even need haste for us to really utilize him. Is slam him on the battlefield, attack somebody with the board state we already have, and boom, we're already generating treasure tokens, and then if they let us untap with him, they're probably just going to lose the game. Last but not least, we have Mondrak. I know this one's not very fancy, but it's just a creature that's going to double up on all of our tokens, and it's notably the only token doubler in this deck. If you wanted to take it to the next level, adding more token doublers is going to be beneficial, but remember, there is diminishing returns on that because the token doublers don't generate tokens by themselves. Moving on to how we are going to win the game with this deck, we have our Drum Bellower and Seedborn Muse. Once we get up to even 4 tokens, this is going to generate a ton of value for us because that means we're able to draw at at least 4 cards per rotation, or we can just throw 4 counters on our commander. Remember, this is just with 4 tokens, so once we get 8 tokens or 6 tokens, we can start doing even more insane things like draw upwards to 8 cards a rotation, or add upwards to 24 power to our commander each turn with these on the battlefield. Virtue of Loyalties, again, not a very splashy card, but for 2 mana, we do get a token on the battlefield, and then for 5 mana, we do get to put 1/1 counters on our entire board. Remember, we are on Cutsil, so that's notable, and then it is going to untap all of our creatures, which again, very notable with our commander's ability, because we don't even have to attack with our creatures to get this ability, right? We can just tap them down to get value with our commander, and then they're still going to untap whether we attacked with them or not. It just gives a lot of flexibility to what we do on our turn. Cathar's Crusade is a legitimate win con to this deck, especially when you take into account we're running cards like Krinko and Anan Pakal. Even with our creatures that generate 1 treasure token each upkeep, that's putting 4 counters on our entire board state every single turn while our board state's getting bigger. This card, if it sticks on the battlefield and you have a meaningful board state, you're just going to run away with the game, especially once you start adding extra combat math to the Krinko with Cathar's Crusade and an additional combat. It just gets insane very quickly. Jetmir is another card we're using to win the game. This is basically a 4 mana Craterhoof Behemoth. It is not hard to get to 9 creatures in this deck, and once you get there, you're going to basically win the game just by slamming this guy on the battlefield. Aurelia the War Leader and Karlach Fury of Avernus. Why I chose these two as our extra combat users is because they don't need haste to work, or Aurelia already has haste, right? So we can just cast these very expensive creatures and they're instantly going to do the thing we want them to do, which is give us an additional combat step. Anzrag the Quake Mole has a very funny interaction with Reconnaissance. Now, Reconnaissance is good in the deck for a plethora of reasons. Remember, we're running a lot of cards like Krinko and Impakal, even our Myrill. They need to attack to get their value, but they're easily chump blockable in the early game or late game if we cast them and our opponents have big creatures. So being able to have Reconnaissance and then untap them if they're blocked and pull them back from combat while also getting their ability feels very, very good. And then we have Anzrag the Quake Mole. Now this guy has a really weird interaction, but once this guy attacks, if he's blocked, we're gonna get an additional combat step after this, right? And then for 7 mana, we can make it to where Anzrag has to be blocked this turn by our opponents if they're able to. So with Anzrag on the battlefield and his ability paid for, a blocker our opponent has, and then Reconnaissance on the battlefield with any creature with an attack trigger, such as an Adeline, an Anan Pakal, a Krinko, we're going to generate infinite creatures. Because what's going to happen is we're going to attack with all of our creatures, they're going to have to block Anzrag, and then we just remove all of our creatures from combat, and boom, we've generated an infinite amount of creatures this way, because we can do that as many times as we want, and we're never going to deal combat damage as long as we keep pulling back all of our creatures with Reconnaissance. Now, how do we win the game from there? It's very simple, really. We can just go to combat and attack them with our massive board that we've generated and our near infinite creatures, or we can just end the game with a Halo Fountain, or even all will be one. Because remember, once we've generated an infinite amount of tokens, our commander is able to draw our entire deck and generate infinite mana. So just something to think about, and this is a crazy interaction our deck can pull off if we get these 3 pieces on the battlefield with our commander out. I do just want to speak about the utility of Halo Fountain here for a second. This thing does everything we want. It generates us tokens, it can draw cards, and then it can even win us the game. Another very notable thing that it does is it actually causes us to untap our tapped creatures, so this allows us to even get more value off of our commander when it hits the battlefield. All will be one, also amazing in this deck. This is going to control the board on an insane rate. Remember, all we need is 4 tokens, and we can put 3 counters on our commander whenever we want just by tapping them. So we essentially have a lightning bolt whenever we want, as long as this is on the battlefield. And then this just flat wins the game with anything like a Dragon Broodmother or even like a Cathar's Crusade. There's a lot of ways to generate a lot of 1/1 counters out of nowhere in this deck that are kind of hidden and not maybe obvious at first look, but once you start looking at the list, you're like, oh yeah, this probably can just win us the game in this deck. Moving on to the high synergy synergy cards, we have Hank. I kind of like the way this guy plays in this deck. Early game, we're going to make some deals. I'll give you some zombies. You use them to block. Maybe they want to protect their life total. I don't know. It's just very good for deal making in the early game. And then late game, when we have our Drum Bellower or Seedborn Muse on the battlefield, we're able to kill all 3 of the zombies that we gift to our opponents, and that's going to draw us 3 cards a rotation, which is going to be massive. Not to mention, this guy has been known to kill a ton of mana dorks and really just slow our opponents down, and I don't want to hear anything about there being an S in his name because I don't see it. Savala, Heart of the Wilds, is going to generate a ton of mana in this deck because our commander is going to get massive, and it's going to catch our opponents off guard because honestly, they're going to get bored after reading this card's second ability, being like, oh, okay, he's drawing cards and generating mana, and they're not going to see us hitting them with a 24/24 bunny out of nowhere. And then again, that means Savala is just going to tap for 24 mana. Pretty insane. Wand of the World Soul is another card I love here because it gives the next spell you cast Convoke. Notably, there is some confusion around Convoke, and let me just set that straight here. You can tap your creatures for colored mana, it just has to be the same color as that creature. So if you generate a green creature token, you can convoke a spell and pay for the green pip by tapping a green creature. Giving a spell Convoke literally gives you the opportunity to cast high CMC spells for free. Cut Seals in this deck, again, there's a ton of ways to buff our creatures up and get them past their base power. So this is basically just going to be a Toski or Orin Frostfang. And you better believe we are running Toski and Orin Frostfang in this deck as well, just because of the insane card advantage we are going to get off of them. Benny Brack, Zoologist, is going to synergize amazingly with our creatures that generate 1 token on each opponent's upkeep, because this just makes it to where we draw 4 cards a turn very consistently. Rite of Harmony is also kind of insane in this deck because you cast it and then any creature that enters the battlefield that turn is going to draw you a card. So with stuff like Myrael's Shield of Argive or even your Krinkos, this can generate a ton of cards out of nowhere. Rishkar's Expertise and Return of the Wildspeaker is just in the deck to benefit off of our commander's high power, and then Return of the Wildspeaker can honestly be a solid game ender in this deck as well. We are then running Heroic Intervention, Galadriel's Dismissal, and Clever Concealment as our protection pieces of choice. Notably, Galadriel's Dismissal is very flexible here. This has stopped my opponents from winning before, and it saved my entire board state before. It's just a very flexible card. That's going to do it for the deck tech, guys. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe if you want to support the channel. It's free and I really appreciate it. With that being said, I would like to shout out my patrons, Newsome, Excessum, Chicken Salad, Preator, and Irrelevant. You guys are amazing. I hope this helped you in your deck building endeavors, and I will see you guys in the next one.